This is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560. The Answer.
Good morning, Dan. And in for Amy this morning, Kristen McQuarrie from the Chicago Trib at board. And Kristen, I found the interview of Steve Bannon on 60 Minutes really fascinating and insightful yesterday. I mean, after Charlie Rose got done interviewing himself and he allowed Steve Bannon into the conversation. That part was good. The Charlie Rose talking to himself was less good. But
do you know, I have a picture of him were you at the last Republican convention? You were there.
Yeah. I think so.
He was sitting off in the big auditorium asleep. Like Charlie Rose, like he kind of fell asleep on his lap. So maybe that's part of the.
Oh, yeah, at the RNC.
At the RNC,
yeah, I do remember
I'm
that.
Sorry,
I do remember that.
I tweeted out a picture of him kind of asleep in his little tennis shoes.
Well, I mean, he needs to rest up for these big interviews because he has trouble following his own logic, as was on display in that discussion with Steve Bannon. Bannon covered a lot of ground, and we've covered a lot of the ground he covered so far. We're going to cover more. I mean, importantly, he has contempt for the foreign policy establishment of the last three administrations. He has declared war on the GOP establishment that he says wants to nullify the 2016 election and the associated policy agenda that provided victory for President Trump. And he also had this to say about Trump and Twitter. Not even General Kelly can stop Trump and his Twitter feed.
No, it's what he says that you deem that the mainstream media, the pearl clutching mainstream media, the pearl clutching mainstream media, what they deem is not correct. What they deem is not right.
No, it's not a question of being right or not right. It's a question
what's appropriate.
It's not a question of appropriateness.
It's what you deem is.
It's a question of whether it's in his interest. That's the point.
I think
not the appropriateness of it.
Okay, I don't think he needs the Washington Post and the New York Times and CBS News, and I don't believe he thinks that they're looking out for what's in his best interest. Okay, he's not going to believe that. I don't believe that, and you don't believe that. Okay, this is another standard and judgment that you rain upon him in the effort to destroy Donald Trump. He knows he's speaking directly to the people who put him in office when he uses Twitter. And if sometimes it is not in the custom and tradition of what the opposition party deems is appropriate, you're absolutely correct. It's not. And he's not going to stop. And by the way, General Kelly, who I have the most tremendous respect for and has put in very tight processes, he's not going to be able to control it either because it's Donald Trump. It's Donald Trump talking directly to the American people. And say something else, you're going to get some good there, and every now and again, you're going to get some less good. Okay? But you're just going to have to live with it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And if you're with him, you're with him. That's how it should be, according to Steve Bannon. Now, just to give some equal time, I want to offer a response from Maxine Waters.
Please don't.
Yeah, no.
Please.
No, it's important.
Please.
She's been targeted for elimination, according to her. This Financial Services Committee hearing last week about cybersecurity and threats online and the trials and tribulations of one no justice, no peace, Maxine.
I think we should focus a lot on domestic terrorism also. So I would like to ask again, given all that you have said, about how difficult it is and the privacy concerns. Do you have any thoughts about what we can do to begin to deal with the KKK and the white nationalists, the extremists, the alt-right? They're on the internet, the Breitbart. If you look at the YouTube, you see how much they want to kill me and others. What can we do?
Well, we'll put that question now to our friend Joel Pollak, Chicago native, senior editor-at-large at Breitbart, as it's called by Maxine Waters, author of the book See No Evil, 19 Hard Truths The Left Can't Handle. Joel, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
I need some more Maxine Waters. We want more.
Well, exactly. I hope she lives forever. Absolutely.
Yeah, front page every day.
So, so can you allay her fears that you're, attempting to do her harm in some way?
In fact, Maxine, why don't you send me an email? We want to set you up with a regular column. I want to hear those pearls of wisdom every week.
So what about, getting back to a serious note in Steve Bannon's interview, what about his declaration of war against the GOP establishment, which he says is attempting to nullify the 2016 election?
Well, if I can maybe straighten out one thing, I think Steve is correct to say that we're at war. I would, however, add that it's not a war that we started. It's not a war the Republican base started. It's not a war the Tea Party started. And it's a war that the establishment started against the voter base of the party. And it's not just a talking point or some kind of a political counterpunch. It's actually the truth. It's what I saw as a journalist sitting in on meetings, many of which were off the record or behind closed doors in Washington, D.C., among members of the establishment, among members of the donor class, and listening to what they were saying. They wanted a civil war against the Republican base after 2012. They wanted to blame the 2012 loss, where Mitt Romney lost to Barack Obama, and Barack Obama was reelected. They wanted to blame that on the Republican base. In their mind, they rationalized that loss by arguing or believing, convincing themselves to believe, that Mitt Romney had been pulled to the right by the Tea Party, and therefore the electorate had rejected him for that reason. And so when they did the autopsy after 2012 and they published it, they assumed that Congress would pass immigration reform or amnesty. It was just a one-liner dropped in there. All of the other policies they thought the Republican Party needed to adopt, all the changes it needed to make, those were discussed in depth and in detail because they knew people would disagree about various aspects of it. But they just presumed that amnesty would get pushed through and that this was very important because Mitt Romney had done so poorly among Latino voters. And they decided there wasn't going to be a debate about that issue. They were just going to push out those who disagreed with the establishment view on that issue and on other issues. And they said, we want to go to war against the base. We want to get these people out of the party. And they're not talking about the extremists, the fringe element who aren't Republicans anyway. They're talking about ordinary voters. They're talking about the Trump voters who showed up and gave him power in 2016. So this is a war they started. And I say that with great determination because I'm not a person who likes this internal fighting. I'm not a person who likes the internecine warfare inside the GOP. I think the glory days, if you will, of the conservative media were before 2012, where there was a broad unified front where conservatives of all stripes, libertarian, social conservatives, whatever, came together to resist the left and resist Obama's agenda. And that split apart after 2012, but it didn't split apart because of the Tea Party. The Tea Party lined up to vote for Mitt Romney. The Tea Party were Mitt Romney's most reliable voting bloc. It happened because the establishment decided they would try to win without the base.
But let me just pick up on this. So what Bannon said in his interview with Charlie Rose essentially is he fears that DACA, come 6 months from now in the winter of 2018, could foment even greater civil war than is afoot right now. And how is Breitbart going to position itself if Trump agrees to a deal on DACA to provide some permanent status to the DACA designees? Because then it seems like it's a tripartite situation. The establishment, Trump essentially dealing with the establishment, and then, Breitbart and those more hardliners when it comes to any sort of amnesty for any sort of population.
Well, I think it depends what kind of deal there is. If Congress decides to give the DACA beneficiaries some kind of permanent status, it will have to be in exchange for border security, and that border security will have to come first. That's the order in which this has to happen. That's what we learned from the past decade or more of debates about immigration policy, that the country does not want to deport people who were brought here as children. They feel that's unfair. But at the same time, the country does not want to grant any kind of amnesty when there's a chance it could happen again. People want the border to be secured. They want the laws to be enforced. If we grant amnesty to anybody, it's going to be the last time. And so I think it depends what the deal is. I think you'll find different views even within Breitbart on this issue. Mm-hmm. I'm not as worried about DACA beneficiaries staying in the country, perhaps, but I think it depends how that deal is arrived at. And if it's just said up front that we want to legalize DACA 100% the way it was, just codifying it in law, I think that's a losing proposition, and I think that Democrats will come out and ask for even more than DACA over the next 6 months, and then I think that presents President Trump with a real problem, and I think that's what Steve was talking about.
Can you talk a little bit about, now that Steve Bannon is back at Breitbart, what sort of thing readers might see differently? And I want to ask you, I know you address this often, but it probably can't be often enough, especially after this interview last night. Breitbart gets a bad rap for supporting the alt-right movement, and part of that is because Bannon referred to it at one point as the alt-right website. Could you talk a little bit about what it means having him return, and then also how do you deal with that constant criticism that you are a website that favors white nationalists?
Well, if it's a website that favors white nationalists, they're doing pretty poorly because, I was editor-in-chief for 2 years, and I am a Jew, an observant Jew from overseas. Actually, I was born in South Africa. So you've got an African Jew running the website. That would be pretty bad for white nationalism.
But you're a valedictorian of Skokie High School, is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Niles North High School, yeah.
Niles.
And, we had one of the most diverse student bodies. We were kind of the cutting edge at that point of having that kind of immigrant-heavy student population, and we loved it. We called ourselves the model UN in the West Cafeteria. My friends were from every conceivable background. It was a fantastic place to go to school for that reason. And actually, if you go back and look at the old Skokie Review when I was making my speech as valedictorian, I held up a prop. I had a globe that I was spinning during the speech, and that's because that's who we were, and that's who we are. We are the world coming together as Americans in Skokie, in Chicago. And, at that time there was...
You're not going to break into song, are you? We are the world?
We are the
Come on, a few bars. A few bars.
We are... He's probably too young.
We are the world. But the thing is, then it was just presumed everybody was legal. There wasn't this attempt to rationalize illegal immigration. That's another issue for another time.
But talk about the website and Steve Bannon coming back and the bad rap that you get.
Well, at some point you just stop caring about the bad rap because it means people are afraid of you, right? When they have to lie about you, it means you're effective, and it means they're afraid of you. And I kind of like the fear. I think the fear allows us to be more effective because the left does not fear the mainstream media. They do not fear most conservative media. They don't fear the Republican establishment. They fear us, and they make themselves more afraid by spinning these lies. And I find it makes us more effective. It means that when we say something, it has a more resounding echo because it comes with that edge that is largely of their own creation. It has nothing to do with us. If you look at who Breitbart is, there's a page on our website, We Are Breitbart. You introduce yourself to the editors and the reporters and the whole staff. I mean, you'll just see how diverse we are. But it's our ideas that they're afraid of. That's why they tarnish us with that label. And at some point, you just stop caring about it. It's lost its bite.
One of my
but the other side.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry, just to answer your question about with Steve Bannon back. I mean, everything we do is going to be the same. I think it's going to have extra energy, and I think that having Steve Bannon back is kind of like having LeBron James back at the Cleveland Cavaliers. He's won at the highest level, and it makes us feel like we can do just about anything. I think we're looking ahead to the future with a great sense of hope and optimism about the company. So I think we're going to do some very exciting things.
A couple of my running criticisms of the big government D.C. press corps is lack of self-accountability and institutional knowledge. And so you want to hold conservative media outlets, center-right media outlets to a higher standard. You don't want them to, just excuse bad behavior because the other side does it too. So with respect to Breitbart, is there anything in terms of the content that Breitbart has posted over the years or the tone of said content that you've been uncomfortable with, that you've thought, well, maybe we shouldn't do that, mistakes that were made that demonstrate a little bit of self-accountability and reflection on content?
Sure. I mean, I've personally written almost 6,000 articles with Breitbart, and I regret some of my own articles. I mean, sometimes you have the benefit of hindsight, and you say, gee, I was wrong about that issue. I mean, the one that haunted me after the 2012 election was I said something really nice about Chris Christie. I was trying to sort of justify his bear hug with Obama during the Sandy. I just couldn't fathom that he was doing something so nakedly political as to reach out to Obama in order to secure his own reelection. I just thought he was above all that. And, of course, I was wrong. I mean, there's things like that. When you get an issue wrong, you get a prediction wrong, and sometimes you get the tone wrong. And, in 6,000 articles, there are going to be a few that you wish you could have back again. But you can't dwell on those. You move forward. And I think that the content and tone of the coverage on Breitbart every day speaks for itself. I don't think there's anything we need to be ashamed of. And I think that we're actually more accurate and more careful than mainstream media because we're held to a higher standard. Conservative outlets in general are held to a higher standard. If we make a mistake, it's on CNN. If they make a mistake, it's buried on page 17.
And including all the coverage on immigration and immigration-related issues, Charlottesville, et cetera, you're comfortable with that?
What should I be uncomfortable with?
Well, I'm not. I'm asking a question because there's criticism of the tone, as Kristen mentioned, that it's kind of shadow white nationalist stuff. There's moral equivocations. I mean, they're lodging the same criticisms of Breitbart that they lodge of Trump. So I just wanted to give you the chance to address it.
That could only be said by people who don't read Breitbart. If you actually read what's there, you'll see that it's measured, it's strident sometimes in its opinions. And we don't hide our opinions. We say, look, we're a conservative site. This is who we are. But I don't think there's anything to regret or to apologize for. I think we've been straightforward, and we have nothing whatsoever to do with white nationalism or any of those other things. Those are labels that get thrown around by people who don't want to deal with the ideas. During the Gang of Eight debate back in 2013, when the establishment wanted to force this immigration bill down everybody's throats, and it was a deathly flawed bill, fatally flawed bill, because it did not sequence the policies in the order I mentioned before. It didn't put border security first. It started with legal status at the same time as border security, and that was basically going to make it a non-starter. We were pushing back against that, and I remember talking to senior Republican leaders privately, and they had no idea about why people opposed their policy. And they believed the mainstream media hype, not about Breitbart, but about the voters. They believed that their own voters were nativist or xenophobic. And I tried to explain to them, you're not paying attention. It has nothing to do with any of that. For people like me, coming from an immigrant background, this issue is about the rule of law. I mean, my parents could have lived a fairly comfortable life in the country they were from in South Africa. They weren't running away from religious persecution or even political persecution, although they had political differences with the government at the time. But to them, what was most important was to live in a country where they could raise their children knowing it was a just society, where there was rule of law. My father brought us up with the lesson that when illegality becomes the law, then the entire system is in trouble. That phrase, when illegality becomes the law, that was echoing throughout my childhood. So for me, the immigration issue is about rule of law, and I'm not alone. A lot of people have the same view. It's not necessarily about these individuals who are illegal or don't have documents or whatever you want to say about them, who were brought here by their parents. It's not necessarily about them. They may be very good people. It's about the principle that the reason people want to come to this country is because we uphold the rule of law. And I tried to explain that to Republican leadership, and they're so convinced that they had to save their party. I give them credit for having good intentions. They thought they were saving the party by pushing this through, and they bought the mainstream media hype that anybody opposing them had to be a xenophobic, racist, or nativist. And they just don't understand their own voter base, and they have relied for too long on the cultural war issues like abortion and gay marriage to herd the voters like cattle into the voting booth and just pull the lever for them. They thought if they said the right buzzword on God, guns, and gays, they would get the votes. And we try to tell them, look, America is changing. The party base has specific concerns you're not listening to because you treat them like voting fodder. You've got to listen to what they have to say. So giving those people an outlet, is the furthest thing from bigotry. It's actually democratizing the American political media.
And that's 2016 election, and what we've seen happen on Obamacare repeal and replace, particularly in the Senate, gives voice or gives supporting evidence, I should say, to the contention that they don't know what's happening within their own party. He is Joel Pollak, senior editor at large at Breitbart News, the author of the book See No Evil, 19 Hard Truths the Left Can Handle. Also, if he was alt-right, if he was a white nationalist, in addition to being an Orthodox Jew, I don't think Alan Dershowitz would refer to him as the best student he'd ever had at Harvard Law. I doubt that.
Well, he's very kind, maybe too kind. Certainly there were better students than me at Harvard, and most of them are making a lot more money than I am.
Yeah.
But the truth is, we can't really have an open political discussion in this country, right or left, if we're constantly questioning each other's motives. And I think that's what that charge does. It shuts off the discussion. And there are similar things that conservatives sometimes throw at Democrats that I think we ought to stop doing. That if you want to really have a discussion and come to some sort of consensus, at least on the basic fundamentals of where we should go as a country, we have to accept that the people arguing with us really have the best of intentions. They may not have the best ideas, but that's our job to convince them. Look, I believe that people can be convinced. I used to be on the left in high school and college and shortly after college even. I was very much on the left. I was a Democrat, and it's only through having various experiences and having arguments with people who were prepared to listen to my point of view that I changed my mind. Right. And I believe people can be convinced. So you've got to have the patience to do that, and you can't get there if you're constantly calling people names.
Joel Pollak, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it. Good to talk to you, Joel.
Thank you.
And he joined us on turnkey.pro answer line.
The more you